My wife invited her ex to our son's birthday, and that was when I realized the marriage was already broken. When Emily suggested inviting a few extra people to their son's birthday party, Mark didn't see a reason to question it. Leo was turning 8, and the plan was simple: a backyard celebration, balloons tied to the fence, a cake from the same bakery they used every year, a mix of kids from school and a handful of familiar adults. Emily said it might be nice to make it feel a little bigger, a little more special, and Mark agreed without hesitation, trusting her judgment the way he always had in small domestic decisions. In the days leading up to the party, he was busy with work and preparations, moving through checklists and errands, barely noticing how often Emily checked her phone or how quickly she stepped away to answer calls. On the morning of the party, Mark woke early to help Leo blow up balloons, and while they were working in the living room, he heard Emily speaking quietly in the kitchen, her voice low and careful. Shifting immediately when she realized Mark was nearby, she said it was just a friend, and Mark let it go, telling himself that not every moment needed to be examined. The guests started arriving around noon, filling the yard with noise and movement, kids running between tables, parents making small talk, and for a while everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to. Emily smiled and moved easily between guests, but Mark noticed a tension beneath it, as if she were waiting for something to arrive rather than hosting what was already there. Leo tugged at Mark's arm to show him a new gift, and as Mark turned toward the driveway, he saw a man standing near the gate, holding a wrapped present. It took him a second to recognize him, not because the face was unfamiliar, but because it didn't belong there. Jason, Emily's ex, someone she had dated years before Mark entered her life, someone whose name almost never came up in their home, stood there looking comfortable, almost confident, as if his presence required no explanation. Emily reached him quickly, placing a hand lightly on his arm and speaking to him in a way that was too familiar to be casual. Mark walked over and asked calmly who had invited him. Emily hesitated for just a moment before saying she assumed Mark already knew, explaining that Jason had stayed in touch and that she didn't think it would be a problem since everything was long in the past. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as if she had prepared it before the question was ever asked. Jason greeted Mark with an ease that felt misplaced, saying it was good to see everyone together, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Mark nodded and stepped back, aware of Leo standing close, watching their faces more closely than the balloons or the cake. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene, because this was still his son's day, but from that moment on, he paid attention to everything. He saw how often Emily found reasons to stand near Jason, how their conversations slipped away from the group, how neither of them seemed uncomfortable or cautious. When it was time to blow out the candles, Jason stood closer to Emily than Mark did, a small detail that carried more weight than it should have. As Leo laughed and smeared frosting on his plate, Mark understood that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding, but a choice Emily had made without him. The party continued, but something fundamental had shifted, and Mark knew that once the guests left and the yard went quiet again, pretending nothing had happened would no longer be possible. The party ended the way children's parties usually did, with deflated balloons clinging to the grass, half-empty cups on the tables, and Leo falling asleep on the couch before the last guest had even left. Mark helped clean up, moving through the motions with practiced calm, while Emily stayed unusually energetic, laughing too loudly, insisting everything had gone perfectly, thanking people with an intensity that felt slightly out of sync with the day winding down. Jason lingered longer than necessary, helping fold chairs and carrying trash bags as if he belonged there, and Emily didn't ask him to leave until Mark mentioned that Leo needed to be put to bed. When Jason finally walked toward the gate, he gave Emily a look that lasted just a second too long, something unspoken passing between them that Mark didn't miss. That night, after the house was quiet and Leo was asleep, Mark waited. He didn't start the conversation immediately. He washed dishes, wiped down the counters, and gave Emily space to stop performing. When he finally asked why her ex had been invited without his knowledge, she sighed as if the question itself was exhausting. She said she hadn't thought it was a big deal, that Jason had asked if he could stop by with a gift, and that she didn't want to make things awkward by saying no. Mark pointed out that awkwardness would have been easier to handle than surprise, especially in front of their child. Emily countered by saying Mark was reading too much into it, that he was letting insecurity color a harmless situation. The word insecurity landed badly. Mark reminded her that Jason wasn't just an old acquaintance, but someone she had once planned a life with, and that boundaries mattered, especially when a child was involved. Emily grew defensive, insisting that Mark was being controlling, that she was allowed to decide who was part of her past and who wasn't, and that Leo deserved to know people who cared about him. Mark asked since when Jason had become someone Leo needed, and Emily didn't answer directly. Instead, she said they should talk about it another time, when emotions weren't running high, and went upstairs, closing the bedroom door with a firmness that felt intentional. The next few days were tense but quiet. Emily acted as though the conversation had been resolved simply by ending it, moving through routines with a forced normalcy that left no room for follow-up. Mark noticed small changes that he couldn't ignore anymore. Emily texting late at night, stepping outside to take calls, mentioning Jason casually in stories about errands or mutual friends, as if trying to normalize his presence retroactively. Leo asked once why Jason knew where they lived, and Emily answered quickly, saying he was just an old friend. Mark watched his son absorb that explanation without fully understanding it, and it bothered him more than the argument itself. One evening, while Emily was in the shower, Mark's phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. The text was brief and cautious, asking if he was Leo's father and apologizing in advance for reaching out. It was followed by another message, explaining that the sender was a mutual friend of Emily and Jason, and that there was something Mark deserved to know. Mark sat on the edge of the bed reading the words again, feeling the weight of the situation settle into something heavier and clearer. The friend said she hadn't realized Mark was unaware, that she assumed Emily had already told him Jason had been spending time with her regularly for months, not just at the party, and that the birthday had not been a spontaneous visit. Mark replied slowly, asking for specifics, and when the response came, it confirmed what he had been trying not to conclude on his own. Jason hadn't just been invited into their home. He had been invited back into Emily's life in a way that crossed lines Mark had never agreed to blur. When Emily came out of the bathroom, Mark was sitting quietly, phone in his hand, looking at her with a steadiness that made her stop in the doorway. She asked what was wrong, and for the first time since the party, Mark didn't soften his voice. He told her they needed to talk now, because pretending this was harmless had already cost them more than she seemed willing to admit. Emily didn't sit down when Mark asked her to talk. She stayed near the doorway, arms crossed loosely, as if standing gave her more control over how the conversation would end. Mark told her about the message he had received, about the assumption that he already knew Jason had been around for months, not just at the party, and about how that assumption said more than any accusation could. Emily listened without interrupting, but her face tightened in stages, like she was running through explanations and discarding the ones that wouldn't hold. She said the friend had exaggerated, that people loved to gossip, that Jason had reached out during a difficult time, and that it hadn't meant anything serious at first. Mark asked what at first meant now, and Emily looked away, buying herself a few seconds that only made the silence heavier. She admitted they had been meeting occasionally, always insisting it was innocent, always framing it as catching up, as support, as something that didn't need permission because it belonged to the past. Mark pointed out that the past doesn't get invited into the present without someone opening the door. Emily bristled, accusing him of turning history into a crime and of ignoring how lonely she had felt, how predictable their life had become, how Jason reminded her of a version of herself she hadn't seen in years. Mark didn't argue about her feelings. He asked about her choices. He asked why she hadn't told him, why she'd let their son be part of a situation she knew would raise questions, and why she thought redefining boundaries after crossing them was acceptable. Emily's answers came out tangled, part justification, part deflection, and when she said that nothing physical had happened yet, the word yet settled between them with a clarity she seemed not to notice. Mark told her that trust didn't collapse because of a single moment, but because of the work it took to keep the truth hidden. The next day, Mark didn't go to work early like he usually did. He took Leo to school himself, noticing how his son talked about the party with a mix of excitement and confusion, mentioning Jason's gift and asking whether Jason would come again. Mark said he didn't know, and the honesty felt heavier than any lie he could have offered. After drop-off, Mark met the mutual friend who had messaged him, choosing a quiet cafe where the conversation could happen without spectacle. She confirmed what she had hinted at before, explaining that Emily and Jason had been seeing each other regularly, that the birthday invitation had been discussed in advance, and that many people assumed Mark was aware because Emily never suggested otherwise. Mark thanked her for telling him, not because it made things easier, but because it removed the last layer of uncertainty. When he got home, Emily was already there, moving through the house with restless energy, as if trying to stay ahead of consequences. Mark told her he knew enough now and that he needed space to think clearly, not as a threat, but as a necessity. Emily reacted quickly, saying he was overreacting, that family survived worse, that he shouldn't let outsiders define their marriage. Mark said outsiders hadn't defined anything. They had only exposed what she'd chosen to keep separate. He told her that Jason would not be part of their home or their child's life going forward, and that this was not a request. Emily said she couldn't promise that, not without resenting him. Mark heard that answer for what it was. That evening, after Leo was asleep, Mark began moving Emily's things into the guest room, not in anger, but with a deliberate calm that made the shift undeniable. Emily watched, asking if he was really doing this over one mistake, and Mark replied that it wasn't one mistake, it was a series of decisions that had led them here. As the house settled into a new, uneasy quiet, Mark understood that seeing Jason at the party had not been the betrayal itself, but the moment when the truth had stepped into the open and refused to be ignored any longer. The days that followed felt heavier, not because of arguments, but because of how carefully everything had to be managed. Mark and Emily moved around each other with an awareness that hadn't existed before, measuring words, adjusting routines, trying not to let Leo sense the tension even as it seeped into small moments. Emily slept in the guest room without protest, but the compliance felt temporary, like a pause before resistance rather than acceptance. She continued to insist that Mark was reacting to embarrassment more than betrayal, that inviting Jason to the party had been a mistake in judgment, not a signal of something deeper. Mark listened when she spoke, but he stopped responding to framing and focused only on outcomes. He noticed how often Emily left the house in the evenings under vague explanations, how she took calls in the car instead of the living room, how Jason's name still surfaced in conversation as if his presence needed to be normalized rather than removed. When Mark told her he was setting boundaries for Leo's sake, Emily countered by saying boundaries could be renegotiated, that families evolved, that forgiveness required flexibility. Mark replied that flexibility without honesty only rewarded secrecy. The tension spilled outward. Emily's sister called first, accusing Mark of being cold and unforgiving, reminding him that Emily had always been emotional and impulsive, that he knew who he married. Mark answered calmly that knowing someone didn't mean absorbing every consequence of their choices. Friends began reaching out with concern disguised as neutrality, asking if everything was okay, hinting that they'd heard different versions of the same story. Mark realized quickly that Emily had been shaping the narrative, emphasizing loneliness, omission, and misunderstanding, leaving out timelines and decisions. Rather than confronting each rumor, he chose consistency, keeping routines intact, picking Leo up from school himself, showing up to practices and appointments without commentary. One afternoon, Mark received a message from Jason directly, written carefully, suggesting they talk man to man to clear the air. Mark didn't respond. The message itself was enough to confirm that Emily hadn't drawn the line she claimed to have drawn. That evening, Mark told Emily he had scheduled a consultation with a lawyer, not to punish her or escalate conflict, but to understand his responsibilities and options as a parent. Emily reacted sharply, accusing him of threatening her, of turning a private issue into a legal one, of trying to take control through formality. Mark explained that clarity was not control, and that the absence of clear limits had already done enough damage. Leo sensed the shift more than either of them wanted. He became quieter, asked fewer questions, watched adults closely, and one night asked Mark whether people stopped being a family when they argued too much. Mark told him families change when people stopped being honest, and that adults were responsible for fixing what they broke. Emily overheard that conversation and later accused Mark of poisoning Leo against her. Mark replied that silence would do that faster than truth ever could. As the week ended, Emily asked whether Mark still loved her, not as an invitation to reconcile, but as a test of leverage. Mark answered honestly that love without trust became something else entirely, and that he wasn't willing to redefine it just to avoid discomfort. The distance between them was no longer about space in the house, but about the choices each of them was willing to stand behind, and Mark understood that the next step would force everything that had been managed quietly into the open. Whether Emily was ready for that or not, the final shift didn't come with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums, but with paperwork and calendars, the kind of details that quietly turn uncertainty into structure. Mark met with the lawyer, asked questions he never imagined needing answers to, and left with a clearer understanding of what stability actually required when trust had already been compromised. He didn't rush to file anything, but he stopped pretending that clarity could wait indefinitely. Emily noticed the change immediately. He no longer debated versions of events or tried to win her agreement. He focused on what Leo needed day to day, on mornings that started on time, dinners that happened without tension, and evenings that ended predictably. Emily oscillated between frustration and regret, sometimes apologizing in vague terms, sometimes insisting that Mark's reaction was harsher than the mistake itself. She said Jason was no longer around, then admitted a few days later that she had seen him once for closure, as if naming it differently altered the reality. Mark didn't argue about the word. He noted the pattern. When he told Emily that he was ready to move forward separately unless she was willing to fully acknowledge what had happened and cut contact without conditions, she hesitated long enough for the answer to form on its own. She said she couldn't promise that without feeling trapped. Mark accepted that answer quietly. The conversation that followed was calm and brief. They agreed on schedules, on how to explain changes to Leo without assigning blame, and on keeping adult conflicts away from him as much as possible. Emily moved out a week later, taking the things she needed and leaving behind the life she had tried to rearrange without consent. Leo struggled at first, asking when everyone would be together again, and Mark answered honestly that families sometimes lived in different houses but still loved their children the same way. Over time, the question softened. Leo adjusted to the rhythm Mark worked hard to keep steady, and the house began to feel less tense, even if it was quieter. Emily remained part of Leo's life, but the ambiguity she had relied on was gone, replaced by clear expectations she often found uncomfortable. The moral settled in slowly for Mark, not as a victory or a failure, but as a lesson shaped by experience. Boundaries don't end relationships, avoidance does, and honesty delayed is often honesty denied. Inviting the past back into the present without transparency doesn't create closure. It creates confusion, especially for the people who didn't ask to be part of the decision. Mark learned that protecting a child sometimes meant accepting being misunderstood by adults who preferred easier stories, and that choosing clarity over comfort was not an act of cruelty, but of responsibility.